For those of you who don't know, I'm Michael Acock. I'm our lead pastor. This is Beth Bramstedt. She's our pastor of church life. So I'm excited to get to close our series out. Get to do this with Beth. This is going to be fun. Hey, let's do like we've been doing for the last 7 weeks. Look at a neighbor. Find one. Say, we are better together. Find another neighbor. I am your competitor, or I am your companion. Not your competitor. I am your companion, not your competitor. All right, look across the room. Find someone and say, I choose to connect and not compare. Literally in my head, I was like, don't say it, and then I said it. All right, there it is. Okay, so hey, welcome. We are excited to do this together.
We are in week 7 of our summer series together, as Michael said, and each of these last 6 weeks, and including today, we have talked about characters in the Bible that are better together, and we have left you guys with a transformational question at the end of each week. And so as we kind of launch into our last message today, we want to review those with you so that you can be reminded of what God may have been stirring in you over the last 7 weeks. And so our first one was the story of Priscilla and Aquila. Steve and I talked about them being intentional maximizers. If you can think all the way back that far, that was July 4th weekend, whatever day that was. And our question was, will you be a maximizer? Will you see something in someone that they cannot see?
And then the next week, Beth and Steve again came together, talked to us about David and Jonathan, who are sacred friends. And the question was, who is God giving you in your life that might be a sacred friend?
Week 3 was Paul and Barnabas. That was brought to us by Cody and Mark. And their question for us was related to unlikely brothers. And it was, is there an unlikely brother or sister that you could make a difference with together?
And then Scott Boyd and I got to talk about Moses and Aaron, faithful companions. And the question is, where is a trusted relationship that you might be stepping into faithful companionship in?
And then we had Esther and Mordecai. That was 2 weeks ago with Steve and Miriam. And that question was, who might you help remember that they belong to God and they have a purpose in his kingdom?
And then last week, Joe and Yolanda came along and they helped us with this idea of a covenant relationship between Ruth and Naomi. And so the question is, who's God revealing to you that you might be stepping into a covenant relationship with?
Our hope has been that you would be thinking of people each of these weeks and that names and faces would come to mind, and hopefully you have been cultivating some of those relationships these past few weeks. And so today we're going to end with our final partnership, so to speak. We're going to be talking about the characters of Deborah and Barak from the Old Testament. They are gifted leaders that God put together, and our question for today is, whose strengths can you submit to in order to bring God's people into God's purposes?
All right, so remember those 2 phrases, God's purposes for God's people. Let's jump in. So one of the things that we want to talk about a little bit is just a little bit of our history here at Christian Fellowship, that God has always gathered gifted leaders to submit their strengths together so that God's people, Christian Fellowship, could get into God's purposes. In fact, 44 years ago, our church started. There was a founding team. We talk about that history in our Discovering CF class. So if you're new to Christian Fellowship and want to know more about who we are, there's a class that's going to be coming up later this fall called Discovering CF. We would encourage you to jump in. Hear our history. Know who we are. God has been at work in and through us all along. Some of that founding team in the first decade included some of the guys like Phil Schaefer, Dan Baracco, Scott Williams, and Clay Spencer, who ended up leading together for almost 40 years of our time here. And one of the things that we are blessed by is that we are experiencing God's faithfulness to them and their decision to submit their strengths together and trust in his faithfulness to make them faithful for those nearly 40 years together. And we've been celebrating their contributions over the last couple of years as we've been having several retirement parties and just celebrating the faithfulness of God through their faithfulness here to us. And so we're so grateful. However, about 7 years ago or so, we started a conversation. I actually joined the team nearly 21 years ago. I still feels like I'm like half the age that I should be because I've only been half the time with these guys. But 21 years ago, got to join in, see what God was doing among a group of guys trusting in the faithfulness of God. And then about 7 years ago, we began to ask the question, who's next? Who's coming on the horizon that might lead into the future? And so there was some sense in my heart that I was a part of that, but also there was no Beth and there was no Steve Boole around, and so you guys know that Beth and Steve and I serve together as our executive team here, leading the church with our elders, and the rest of the team that serves Christian Fellowship, which is an amazing, amazing team. But one of the things that I had to do is transition from executive pastor to this role of lead pastor, and I can remember having a conversation with my counselor and having this little conversation. He's like, you seem to be frustrated a lot. I was like, that's why I'm talking to you. That's why you go when you're frustrated. And he said, well, hey, I think you should read this book called Rocket Fuel. And I said, okay, I'll read it. So it's about visionaries and integrators. And I read the first chapter and it had a little quiz at the end. And I discovered that I scored like 80, 85 on the visionary side. But my job was the executive pastor. And he said that might explain why you're a little frustrated. Because you have lots of ideas and vision, but your job is about integrating that vision into the life of the church. And so for me, I have discovered that I really have a lot of dreams for us as a church, but one of my biggest fears is that I can't make those dreams accessible to you. And I can't make it possible for many people to jump in because I can get frustrated if we don't get there fast enough. And so that's where we join in Beth.
So I will never forget the Sunday at the other campus that Michael came up to me and asked if I'd ever heard of the book Rocket Fuel, which I hadn't. It happens to be a business book, but it's written by Christians, so it has a biblical foundation to it and describes the differences between these roles. So I read the chapters and just really resonated with the integrator role and was like, somebody is putting words to all of these thoughts and feelings and things that I have in my being about how God has wired me that I had not necessarily been able to put words to before. And so I took the little quiz and I scored like 98 as an integrator. And so what that means is that I love to execute vision, and I love to bring people into that vision and bring them along together in it. And so this works really well because I don't need to have the vision. And as you guys know, Michael has plenty of vision, plenty of ideas for all of us. It will keep us busy for a long time. But I need to care deeply about what we're doing and what I'm participating in. And so the opportunity came along then for me to join the team here at Christian Fellowship and bring those strengths and those gifting alongside him and alongside the team that we've talked about. We couldn't do this without. And also then at that part of the story, we've mentioned Steve. Along comes Steve. And Steve got to share a little bit earlier in the series about how he ended up back here at CF. It actually revolved around inquiring about the head of school position that we had. But in the discernment, the team figured out that was probably not the best fit, that his best fit was probably as one of our pastors here at the church. And so Steve was kind of a surprise to the equation. He's kind of a third character that came in and surprised us and completely surprised me because I had never met him, never even seen a picture of him until the day he walked into his first service of August 2 years ago. So it's a little bit crazy. But I love this quote that explains, I think, Steve's contribution to the team. It's by Cole Author Riley, and she would say, his arrival shifted us toward deeper wholeness as a team. And so that is what Steve did when he came on.
Yeah, so God's been really faithful to us. And this morning we want to open up Judges chapter 4, so get out your Bibles. Let's look at Judges chapter 4. We're going to look at a story where two gifted leaders really submit to each other's strengths to fulfill God's purposes for God's people. Now, some context for us about Judges and all of that. Let me do a little run up here. If we read the Old Testament as the story that it is, it's the unfolding of God's people continually being brought close to Him and then choosing their own way and living some way either in captivity or in some way God has left them out because they've chosen their own way. And then they cry out, and God comes back and He delivers them. And it's through various means. So it's Moses and Aaron at one point. It's the judges, perhaps where we're at in this story. And then later it's the kings. And the kings actually have a really long list of unfaithfulness. But the context is that Moses and Aaron, our faithful companions, brought the people of God out of Egypt, out of captivity, right up to the edge of the promised land. God had promised them a land that would be theirs. And then Moses and Aaron, Moses doesn't go in. Joshua and Caleb end up taking the people into the promised land, and they end up having victory, and they think, oh, life is good. Then Joshua dies, and there's this wonderful phrase throughout the book of Judges that says this: the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. And it just happens every other chapter. There's about every other paragraph in some places. There's this space where the children of God do evil in the sight of the Lord, which evil doesn't have to be necessarily just a sense of like, oh, they did all this sinfulness. They just literally turned their hearts away from the God who had turned His heart towards them. So it's really helpful for us when we think about that. Now, Judges chapter 2:18 says this: when the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge and delivered them. So judges came before kings in the Old Testament, so that we had these judges that would be raised up, and they would actually bring the people of God back into the purposes of God. Our first judge was Othniel. He delivered the people after 8 years of captivity in Mesopotamia. All right, so they'd done evil in the sight of the Lord. Then they were captive for 8 years. Then we have another judge, Ehud. He delivered the people after 18 years of captivity in Moab. And then after that, they had 80 years of rest. So if you can imagine, that's 2 generations. So here, Joshua's brought them in. They are 3 generations, maybe 4 generations into the promised land. Then we hear about Shamgar, who's another judge who delivers the people of Israel out of some kind of bondage to the Philistines. But we don't really have the details of how long they were in bondage or how long of rest between. But then we run into our story now with Ruth and our story now, which is just this idea of Deborah and Barak. And once again, there's captivity, and it's 20 years long.
All right, so we're going to pick up the story in Judges chapter 4, verses 4 through 10. We're going to put it on the screen so you can follow along. Here we go. Now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapideth, was judging Israel at the time. She used to sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the people of Israel came up to her for judgment. She sent and summoned Barak, the son of Abinadab, from Kadesh Naphtali, and said to him, "Has not the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded you? Go, gather your men at Mount Tabor, taking 10,000 from the people of Naphtali and the people of Zebulun. And I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you by the river Kishon, and his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand." And Barak said to her, to Deborah, "If you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go." And she said, "I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman." Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. And Barak called out to Zebulun and Naphtali and called them to Kadesh. And 10,000 men went up at his heels, and Deborah went up with him. So we're going to dig in a little bit into our characters in this story. If you can get past all of the names that are really hard to pronounce and the geography, that will be a message for another day. But we're going to focus in on our characters, and we're going to start with Deborah. So Deborah was the 4th of 12 judges that are listed in the book of Judges. She happened to be the only female judge, and she was the only judge who also served Israel as a prophetess. So she judged Israel as God's mouthpiece for over 40 years. And as part of that role, what she did was she corrected abuses and she addressed grievances among the people. But she did more than just arbitrate or issue civil decisions. She was a spiritual director of the people. In chapter 5, Deborah calls herself the mother of Israel. And that is because her heart was always to draw the people of Israel back to God. That was her desire, and that was her role. Another beautiful thing that we know about Deborah is that she didn't pursue or work for her power. These verses tell us that she actually sat in her power and authority. She sat underneath a palm tree and served the people from that place. I love this quote by theologian Matthew Henry, who he describes Deborah in this way. He says, "Her name signifies a bee. She answered her name by her industry, her sagacity, and her great usefulness to the public, her sweetness to her friends, and her sharpness to her enemies." So that's Deborah. And next we have Barak. What do we know about Barak? Barak was a military commander and a warrior of great faith. So this is not the only place that Barak is mentioned in the Bible. He's also mentioned in 1 Samuel chapter 12. And in those verses, it talks about him delivering the Israelites out of the hands of the enemy. So this was something he had done before. As well as he's called out in Hebrews 11. So Hebrews 11 is the chapter we tend to call the Great Hall of Faith, where the author lists all of those in the lineage and in the stories of God that were known for their faith. And so it says that he came along with Gideon, with Samson, with David, and Samuel, and then this is the quote, "who through their faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, and obtained promises." So their reasons for being listed in the Hall of Faith go on for several more verses even after that quote. So Barak was accomplished in battle, and he was known for his faith. So both characters that we've met here are leaders in their own right. The scripture says Barak summoned 10,000 men. Okay, that's about enough to fill the Hearn Center here in Columbia. And we know if Deborah was serving as a judge of that area, she was serving over more than just the soldiers, so she would have been serving more than 10,000. So God has raised up these two to fulfill a massive task in his plan to defeat the Canaanites so that his people could rest and live peacefully in the promised land. So in this part of the story, our characters meet up, and they meet up when Deborah summons Barak. As a prophetess, she serves as a remembrancer. And so she was reminding Barak of God's call to him to assemble this army and to take the land. And so Barak, we know, has a very interesting response here. He says, "If you will go with me, I will go. If you won't go with me, I won't go." So what's happening here? Barak is noticing here that God has brought the two of them together for this task, that what they need is each other's strengths. He was convicted that he needed God's continual presence to go with him, and that Deborah embodied that presence in her role and in her personhood, and that they would be better together. And so starts our story.
And so for the sake of time, we're going to summarize the last little bits of the story. About Judges chapter 4, verses 11 to 16, you notice the mention of a man named Eber. He shows us that actually there were some of the people of Israel who were in captivity who had made peace, it says in chapter 5, with the king of Canaan, Jabin. And so he was actually living apart from the people. And he's mentioned here a little bit because he helps out Sisera, the general of King Jabin's army, the enemy of the people of God. Now Sisera, who is the general, has 900 chariots. The people of Israel don't have chariots. And so 900 chariots of iron, as it's said, would be the equivalent of saying they had tanks. So if you've seen the movie 12 Strong, where American forces jump in and help some of the people in Afghanistan, they were all on horseback, and then all of the Russians in opposition had tanks. And so it was quite a disparity. And so if you're looking at the people of God, this might be why Barak was a little bit hesitant to just jump in and lead into war. He knew that they were out-armed with chariots. So Deborah, though, comes again to Barak, and now they've gone together. He's gathered his 10,000 men in Tabor, and she says, now's the time. Now's the time you should go and attack. So they head down the mountain. They're going to go attack. But if you notice in chapter 5, verses 19 through 21, there's a little reference to thunder and lightning and the torrent of Kishon. So in the midst of this battle, when they sing the song later, after the battle's over, there's this idea that the Kishon was a small river, but it was usually dry. There was no torrent ever. And then there was this idea of lightning that was happening. And so some of the commentators help us understand that this probably is a reference to a thunderstorm. God brings a storm right at the beginning of this battle, and all of a sudden you have lightning that's scaring the horses and flipping over chariots, perhaps. And you have a torrent of water running through Kishon, which is actually sweeping away the soldiers who now have no chariots. And so now they're in the battle with God helping them.
And so now we continue, and the story picks up in chapter 4 and verses 17 through 22. So the Israelites are winning the battle. And as we know from the portion of scripture I read, the author tells us earlier that God will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. So now we get to figure out what that means. Here's where the third crucial character comes into the story. And her name is Jael, which happens to mean mountain goat. That's what that means. So I'll come back to why that matters in a minute. As the Israelites were winning the battle, Sisera, who Michael explained was the commander of Jabin's army, he decides to flee. He flees his decimated army and basically runs away. And so as he's doing that, he comes to the property of Eber and sought refuge, knowing that Eber was an ally to King Jabin. However, Eber's wife, Jael, was not. She was in alliance with the people of Israel. And so he sought refuge there. And Jael welcomes Sisera into her tent. She covers him with a blanket, and she gives him some milk. And so basically what this means in that context is that she was being very kind and very hospitable to him, letting her in, letting him take refuge. But what we know is that she had a totally ulterior motive, because after he had eaten and had fallen asleep, she killed him. Now, that is the G-rated version. If you would like to know how she killed him, you can look that up in verse 21.
Just be wary of anyone with milk and tent pegs.
So in this act of Jael taking the opportunity and sensing the opportunity from God and killing him, then Deborah's prophecy is fulfilled, and God brings victory to the Israelites. So he gave them access to the land of milk and honey. So this is the part that's just a fun fact I'd like to give you. So he gave them access to the land of milk and honey, in part by the contributions of two women whose names were Bee and Mountain Goat. So God has this way of assembling gifted leaders, and in this case, assembling them to help return his people to his purposes. That's what the story's about.
All right, so in Judges chapter 4, verse 23, it's probably the most important verse in this passage. So on that day, God subdued Jabin, the king of Canaan, before the people of Israel. Now, we've just read about Deborah and Barak and 10,000 soldiers and Jael and all of this group of Israel who went to war. But verse 23, the most important verse, says this: God subdued. You see, anytime we step into the purposes of God, for the purposes of God's people, God is always the main character. It's so important for us, because if you read chapter 5 of Judges, it is a song of Deborah and Barak, and they over and over and over rehearse how blessed they are in God, and that God is the one who brought victory. And so you have to understand that when there are gifted leaders, it is because God is still the main character. Gifted leaders are not the main characters. Does that make sense? We have to understand that no matter who the leader is, they're not the main character. They're participants in God's purposes for God's people.
So what we have the opportunity to do is, as gifted leaders, we are choosing to submit to one another's strengths for the purpose of bringing God's people here at CF into God's purposes. Say that again. As gifted leaders, we are choosing to submit to one another's strengths to bring God's purposes to bring God's people into God's purposes. So a few things we want kind of to leave you with in terms of points of application from this story. The first one is this, which Michael just said for us. God is the main character in deliverance and destiny, and our job is to respond to his invitation to participate. God is the main character in the deliverance and in the destiny, and we get to respond. So again, it's God's people and it's God's purposes. In our story, God had been with the people of Israel since the very beginning. He had brought them out of captivity and into the promised land. He promised to go with them, and he did, and he gave them victory. Again, it says that he is the one that subdued. Deborah and Barak were submitted to God's purposes, and they were submitted to those purposes for the people of Israel and their deep love for those people. And that's what destiny is. Destiny is when God brings us into his purposes for the sake of his people. So this idea of destiny is not something that belongs solely to the characters in the Bible. It's something that we can experience too, because he brings us into his purposes for the sake of his people. And our job is what? Is to say yes to the invitation. We must respond to the invitation, pay attention to the undercurrent of the Holy Spirit's leading and the ordering of all of the steps that he is setting in motion. Now, whenever I have a tendency to get stressed or get really busy or feel like I don't have enough time to get everything done and feel very, very frenzied, I have to stop and remind myself of this truth. And to remember this, that this is God's kingdom, right? CF is God's kingdom. Columbia, the earth, it's God's kingdom. And his kingdom is not in trouble, and neither am I.
Amen.
And whatever I don't have the capacity to do, God has the capacity to do. So my role is to say yes, and to say yes and honor him with that.
God is always using the strengths of imperfect people to fulfill his purposes for his people. So when God is the main character, you can actually bring all your strengths and all your weaknesses to the table. You get to bring your whole self, because that's actually what God has invited. Is if God's the main character, then he already knows your weaknesses, and he knows your strengths, and he knows the person beside you. He knows their strengths, their weaknesses, and he's putting you together so that he gets the glory and we step into his purposes. Now, destiny is a really important word over the word potential. You see, when you are talking about potential, you think about your strengths and what your strengths will bring you to. But by default, potential means I have to be in isolation, and I am an island of my strengths to get to where I'm supposed to go. And that would be terrible, that you would live in isolation. But even worse than that is that you would actually use your strengths and use everyone else around you to get to where you're supposed to go. Destiny is the thing that creates room for everyone, because destiny is God given. It is something that he's bringing me into, but he's also bringing a bunch of other people into. And so I can always receive the strengths of others in the middle of the story. Many of our partnerships over this series have been imperfect people. Paul and Barnabas, they get in a fight. Moses and Aaron, they have their things. Esther and Mordecai, those were great stories to help us see that God uses imperfect people. All of us have imperfections. We all have weaknesses that we bring to the game. For me, I have these great, wonderful dreams and hopes and desires that I believe God's put in my heart for us. But I get really frustrated when we don't get there fast. And so sometimes that frustration can be experienced. I was talking with our staff actually at our big in-service this last week. School starts here in just a few days. And I was saying, I have had moments when I have been like, let's do the job. Let's go love people. Let's go love people with the love of God. And the people around me didn't know that I loved them. You see, when you get frustrated at pace and you get frustrated because you have something to do, you have to learn to submit to someone else's strengths. And as I've submitted to somebody else's strength, to Beth, to Steve, to our team, they help us go at a pace that we can all come along and enjoy. And actually, I get to slow down enough to love the people I'm with.
Also, we are all leaders who have the opportunity to submit our strengths to one another to fulfill God's purposes. We are all leaders. So I know there's probably some of you out there who may be asking, does this message have any application to me? Because I'm not a leader. I don't consider myself a leader. But in the context that we're talking about, you are a leader if you have influence. If you have influence, and I know everyone in this room has influence with someone, whether it's a coworker, your spouse, your children, we all have influence. And so when we begin trusting God and others with ourselves, we begin to build these relationships of trust. Relationships where we can trust each other. And as those relationships grow, we allow these relationships to influence us, and we influence them, right? So as I get to know you, you influence me, I influence you. And then we have the opportunity to act on that influence. We can choose to submit to one another's strengths. This is the story of Deborah and Barak. They had a relationship of trust. They began to submit to each other's strengths. It's our story. It's Michael's and my story, as we've shared a little bit about how that works here in our leadership partnership. It is the story of our team. It is the story of the congregation of CF. We all have the opportunity to submit to each other's strengths in order to fulfill God's purposes. Also, another thing we've noticed is that the strengths of the team you start with are not necessarily the strengths of the team you will end with. And so there's always that X factor, that surprise, that additional character who might come into the story. So in this story, that was JL, right? It was also the 10,000 members of the army. Everyone had a role to play. And in our story here, I mentioned Steve. Steve was a surprise. And so each person in the story has a role to play. So we always need to be open and paying attention and watching as to who God might be inviting into the story. And then can we bring them along and ask them to participate? And also paying attention in case that person is us. What if it's you? If God's inviting you into the story in some way.
The last thing we want to share this morning, just a little principle to pull out, is that when we submit our fears, we allow another to submit their faith. When you submit your fears, you allow someone else to submit their faith. I want to ask you a question about how you read the Old Testament. Because if you read the Old Testament with the voice of God in your head as kind of angry all the time and frustrated and mad all the time, then you're going to read this story a little harshly. That Barak's a complete disobedient, fearful person, and that Deborah is this condescending prophetess. But I'd like us to consider for a moment that what if Barak just had some fear? And Deborah was able to just bring her faith alongside his fear, and they were to do something together that neither of them could have done by themselves. And the reason why I ask this question, and the reason why I want us to consider how we read this, is because we should read the Old Testament knowing about Jesus. We get to take the lens of Jesus and look backwards on the Old Testament and see what God was doing here. And actually, I think we'll find some pretty powerful things. If you can imagine that when Deborah comes and calls Barak in, and she says to him, "Hey, you know God has spoken to you to deliver his people. Something leaped in Barak's heart. Because Barak seems to respond like he said, yeah, I know. I know that. I know that God has spoken to me. Now, if you're in the context of 20 years of captivity and God speaks, we don't know when God spoke. Was it 5 years in? Was it the first year of captivity? Was it the 10th year? Was it the 15th year? Was it just that year? We don't have any clue when that was. But we do know that it seems like Barak knows that God had spoken to him. And this is the role of prophecy, guys. This is the role of what prophecy does, is God speaks something to you. It may be 5 years old, 10 years old, 15-year-old, 20 years old, and somebody's going to come along and say, you know that God has called you to do this or that. And instead of feeling shame, you should feel empowered because God has not left you behind. God will never leave you behind. What he has called for you and wants you to step into in destiny, he is in control of getting you there. Now, a very powerful thing that we need to understand is that when Deborah says to Barak after he says, will you go with me? Because if you don't go, I'm not going. If you read it like some people read it, it's like he's so chicken. He's afraid. And in fact, if you want to go all, 8th grade gym on him, it's like, hey, Barak's just got to have a girl come with him. That's not what's happening. The powerful faith of Deborah comes along, re-enlivens the word of the Lord to Barak in his heart. And he says, I won't go unless you go. Because she represented something. She represented faith, and she represented the presence of God. And what does she say to him? She says, because you've asked me to go, you won't get the glory. Now, we act like that's a statement about punishment. What if it was actually a statement of Barak saying, I'll give up all my glory and all my pride if I have the presence of God? Do you understand the power that this is? Is when two leaders say, it's not about me, but it's about his presence, and it's about his purposes and his people. It doesn't matter anymore. And he says, I'll go if you go. And she says, I will go. And so Barak, with the presence of God, leads 10,000 people into victory. It's a pretty powerful thing when you think about the fact that your fear is actually a lack of the sense of the presence of God. And so instead of trying to be courageous and outdo your fear, what if your fear is actually the thing slowing you down enough so that someone can come alongside of you as the representative of the presence of God and bring faith to you? And then you move at a pace that faith allows. Because Barak didn't just charge off. He went and gathered on the mountain, and then faith spoke again and said, now's the time. Go attack. You see, faith is this thing that moves us because God is in the middle of all of that. And so when you have a fear, the sense or the lack of the sense of the presence of God, it is because it's holding you in place until faith comes and the presence of God comes. It's so important for us to understand that.
So as we close this morning, we want to bring you back to the transformational question that we asked in the beginning. Whose strengths can you submit to bring God's people into God's purposes? Whose strengths can you submit to? You see, we get to be Deborah and Barak to each other. We get to submit our strengths to help bring God's people into his purposes. This is something that was very real for them and their story. Barak needed to be reminded, as Michael said. He needed Deborah's faith added to his own faith. He needed her presence in battle. And Deborah needed Barak's calling. She needed his military strength, his ability to lead an army in order to fulfill God's prophecy. It wasn't going to happen without him either. The victory was God's, but both Deborah and Barak said yes to participating in their parts in God's story. It was very real for them. Likewise, it's been very real for us.
You see, there's this saying, I think, about leaders that if you look behind you and no one's following you, you're not a leader. And it's so easy when you have big dreams and you have things that you believe God has put in you that you can either go ahead of people and leave them behind, or you can make them tools to accomplish that. Those are the things that God has been speaking to me. This is the reason why I speak about not trusting in ourselves, but we will trust in the Lord. Is that as we go forward, God is teaching us, teaching me, how to submit my weaknesses, how to submit my strengths to the table, and then look around and see how many other people are added to us to give their strengths and their weaknesses as we all step into destiny.
And I might have the opportunity, like I mentioned before, to help get things done and execute vision and to empower and equip you and to bring you along. But if there's nowhere to take you, then what good does that do? So it is a real life submitting to each other's strengths in leadership of anything, and that includes leadership here at CF. It is a joy and it is a privilege for the purpose of fulfilling God's plans for us, whatever that might be. So it is very real to us too. This story is very real. And it's also very real for you, because others people have strengths to add to yours so that you can fulfill God's purposes. Other people have faith to add to your fear so that you can fulfill God's purposes. Those people might be sitting next to you. They may be in this room. So that's our question this morning. As we conclude the service, we're going to just pause for just a second for you to think about whose strengths can you submit to bring God's people into God's purposes.